Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline. Building the future, I feel like a savage.
Hello and welcome. My name is Piers Ridyard. I am the CEO of RDX Works, a core developer of the decentralized finance protocol Radix, a public ledger entirely focused on bringing DeFi into the mainstream. Today, we are doing a slightly different interview, which is going to be with Lluis, who is the head economist at RDX Works, who joined us quite a while ago and has been working in the background on a research project called the Hard Money Project. Now, the Hard Money Project is the background of this starts a very, very long time ago, both for Lluis and for Dan and myself. So when Radix was first founded, it was actually founded as a project called eMoney. And the whole concept that Dan cared about was not just creating a public decentralized ledger that was capable of scaling to billions of people globally, but also about the potential of building a new type of money on top of that, that took some of the thinking that went into Bitcoin, but then applied it to make a more universal type of currencies. Now, the thinking back then was obviously sort of much more primitive than what we see now in sort of all of the stable coins that we've seen come to market and all of the different ways that people can build value and tokens on top of public ledgers. But there is this gap that Dan and I have always discussed and thought about as we were thinking about building a public ledger, because obviously when you're building a public ledger and you're building assets and resources that are native to it, you constantly think about the problem of value transfer and how you can build systems that make value transfer more efficient and less costly. Because ultimately that's what the whole public ledger movement is about disintermediation and about sovereign ownership. And so this was something that Dan and myself have always had on the background, because the first thing you have to do is build the infrastructure, get the infrastructure working. Like it sort of nothing else matters if you can't get a public ledger that functions how it's supposed to. But there's always been this sort of like thought that the thinking hasn't always been big enough when it comes to how you build monetary systems, and this all starts. You need to go back to first principles and think about if you can build entirely decentralized public goods like public ledgers, is it possible to extend that to the concept of money as well? Then entered Lluis. So Lluis, maybe you can start off by talking a little bit about your background, how you got so interested and ultimately are doing a PhD in monetary economics, and how Bitcoin started to feature in that.
So my pleasure feels to be here and to present myself to the big community, to the good community that Radix has. So yeah, about my background, it all started back in 2017. I'm not of those guys that were like super OGs very, very, very early. But I discovered this technology in 2017 while I was working at it was a quantitative investment fund, quantitative asset management, that we provided institutional grade strategies. And so I was in charge of basically, from a strategic standpoint, researching going deep about these technologies, like in concrete Bitcoin and all the evolution of the blockchain. And so the more I started researching and going deep in order to draft what could be a strategy, what we could do, I started feeling more and more into the rabbit hole. I think like all of us, because when you discover this technology, you see that in reality, what it is a paradigm shift. It's the first time in history that we can mandate a ledger on a distributed basis, on a decentralized basis, meaning there's no central party controlling the data. like what the host, those records, those property rights, that everything that's recorded on chain. So Bitcoin started it with money, like the first trial, the first attempt of money, a monetary representation, incomplete a hard money, hard asset. But later on, it evolved in all the technologies that we know. I mean, full stack technologies that you add programmability, improve features on consensus, better scalability, whatever. But the first primitive was with, and that's where it just started. It was started with money and infrastructure. Like, let's find, like Satoshi, the genius of Satoshi, found a way to make a distributed system run autonomously and put on top, program on top, a representative asset, something that is fiduciary in the sense that you have to trust it, but the rules are clear, and that's cool. And yeah, that's how my involvement with this fantastic industry started. And then later on, I moved on. I worked on other things. I moved into a university to work in management, and then, but I was kind of a nerd on these topics, and it was my hobby. Research deep. I have a very research oriented mindset. I'm a very analytical. My background on studies comes from research, so I went deep. So back in 2021, I decided to take a step forward and do something, like do a cool program about these technologies, and I joined the University of Zurich, and that's where an initial, I mean, the proposal of doing a PhD with them, that's where it started. But the distance, because I'm based in Spain, the distance wasn't easy to coordinate.
But why
So
did you at this point start going, I need to do a PhD? Like, what made you go, I need to study this incredibly deeply? What was the impetus for that?
yeah, so the PhD idea came because I honestly believed. I mean, I had some ideas in mind that this institution, the monetary institution, on top of this technology, is still not solved. It's not solved yet. Because from this side, from one side, you have monetary assets and all the copies that we can see from all the cryptocurrencies. That's why they're like what the Bitcoin masses call it shitcoins. But it's basically a deterministic supply schedule that is very hard to set as currency. We could talk about it why later on. But and on the other side, you have PEGs, which are currencies that are dependent, like their monetary currency is pegged to a fiat currency that already exists. So if the idea of the ethos of the entire industry is to distribute power and decentralize it, and you have the infrastructure that allows you to do that, but you don't have the monetary representation, the currency that allows to do that, there's a clash. So you cannot have something, a point of failure from one side in money, and a distributed technology on the other side. Basically, the system in itself is going to have points of failure. So that's why that's where the interest started, to find a way to get an autonomous monetary system in complete standard that will run by itself, minimizing those points of failure.
The interesting thing that I've sort of observed from my time working with you is that you are one of I think the crypto industry, and I think any technology industry that has like sort of so much white space to innovate, often starts things from a first principle basis without looking externally. They just go, I want to create this thing. There's this business opportunity here. I'm going to create this thing. But I'm not going to pull from any of the like work that's been done before. I'm just going to sort of create this thing entirely new. So, the 2017 tokenization craze, like people didn't really draw from like how people already think about or like digitizing assets. They kind of just went, we're just going to create this like from scratch. And I think that you also see that in the DeFi movement in 2020 and 2021, where again, it was very much this like, we've got these primitives, how can we work them to be together and create the next phase of that? And like each phase, we've kind of had very naive implementations of stuff. And I think the thing that always struck me with your work and approach on this has always been, I think out of all of the topics of economics, the concept of money is probably one of the most researched. It's probably one of the because it's so important, practically speaking, to the management of an economy. And so how central banks manage the monetary system, how they manage like M1, M2, M3 money supply, how they think about inflation targeting, how they change rates, how their theories on how things should be done have changed over time, like concepts like the gold standard, all of this stuff that was actually the problem set that mattered, right? Because like I think there's this saying that I hear people say a lot, which is technology magic. What that means by that is you can kind of build anything with tech. Like once you have the tools, you can kind of build anything. But the system design is what differentiates between something that's actually going to have an effect or be important, rather than something that's just like a fun thing that doesn't have longevity. So a lot of like when we first started talking, I think that was the thing that really started to put some of the pieces of the puzzle in place. Because while I think of myself as relatively well read around sort of the topics of economics and things like that, I hadn't ever spoken to someone before that had taken such a very fundamentals based research approach to understanding all of the thinking that has come before on monetary economics and system design within sort of current economies, as well as the history of how those things have come about. And I suppose that's really what it all has to start with. Like you don't have to invent everything from new. You just have to work. You have to be able to. There's this great saying, I think it's from some Swiss watch company, which is like, to break the rules first, you must master them. You have to like understand the principles before you can start to adjust how that principles might work, because you don't know how all of the things are going to affect each other. So like, how did you discover Radix, and how did you come to sort of reach out to us in the first place?
So by being a researcher, by being that geek that like spending time discovering these technologies, and so back then, I was also very intrigued by technologies like, for example, Cardano, that they had an object-oriented model, like a type of UTXO model. But I found some of the limitations on this technology back then that they're corrected already. But I hadn't found any technology that was so, let's say, coherent in its design and based on first principles. The way I think about money, I try to apply it to tech. So I haven't found any technology that was so comprehensive in the way that the full stack was designed as Radix. So it made a lot of sense to me that the way to secure an asset was around an asset, like it represented as an asset, the state represented as an asset, represented as object, the object or orientation model, data model. And from there, building all the layers on top, right? Like the virtual machine, where the programmability embedded into it. And not just that, but the consensus, having the way that the state of Radix is designed, of being a sharded network that commits across shards, and one maintains that asynchronous composability, meaning everything is synchronized, everything can communicate, every shard can communicate with each other in the same commit. So that was mind blowing. And when I found that it was not just another blockchain just having cool stuff, like saying cool stuff, but other blocks. Honestly, one time I shared this with them with Matt. I think they did a beautiful job. They do a beautiful job for the community, like sharing cool, cool good content, like insightful content. So when you read that deep, you see like, wow, these guys, they know what they're talking. They just don't like, they're not just making stuff. So that's why I'm like, this makes sense. This makes a lot of sense. And later on, all the consensus also was peer reviewed, and I think it's the first peer review consensus that scales linearly. That's cool. That meaning both vertical and horizontal scalability. Because you can see other layers that maybe have good vertical scalability, but having horizontal is what really brings that decentralization about being able to basically put as much validators as as the community wants to participate in. That's really democratizing the validation.
And I suppose one of the questions,
All the
I suppose,
properties that
yeah, I suppose one of the questions is like, why does all of this matter or why does all of this matter so much to you? Because like there is you can going back to this whole tech is magic, you can kind of implement most things on top of most things if you have the tools available, and the tools can be either well suited to it or not so well suited to it. What for the thing that you wanted to do, which is like sort of start a new institution of money that's based on self-sovereignty and decentralized principles. Why did the choice of infrastructure matter so much to you, and what was the things that you were seeing about Radix that made you go, I really can't build it anywhere else apart from here?
So for a monetary system that is digital, meaning in this case it's based not just on a database, but on a distributed ledger database, be it a blockchain or other type of distributed system. If you want to build money, that money needs to be seamless, the experience, seamless the transaction, meaning like you cannot pay from, let's say, for a tokenized economy. Okay, let's go that to the roots, to those first principles. If you have a tokenized economy where basically the ownership, the property rights of assets are recorded on chain, because otherwise those property rights are not recorded on chain on a distributed ledger system, it brings points of failure into the system. So if you have a tokenized economy, meaning all types of assets that are tokenized and represented directly, let's say, you need a ledger that can welcome that and have the capacity to really represent that amount of tokenization. And we're talking about quadrillions of assets that could be represented. So first of all, you need a ledger that can support that. And second, it's not just about the representation of the asset, of the property right, but the transaction, the transferability of ownership. And that transferability can be swapped, can be simultaneous, meaning assets, the ownership of assets can be transferred on a simultaneous basis. And not just that, but also composing between different markets. Like you can have an atomic transaction composing different markets between different assets. So if you don't have the guarantee of maintaining atomic composability, you might be paying, and in one leg, in the cash leg, that is called the money leg of the payment, can transfer ownership, but it results that the value that where the assets reside on the swap, they may get denied or may get lost if there's no synchronization in the same transaction. So that's why it's so important to having synchronous atomic composability, and in this case, on a distributed ledger that scales linearly, meaning literally can work on the world. So Radix is the technology that already proved that. Like Dan is doing that. They have already proved it, peer reviewed. Now doing on tests, like very formal tests, let's say, and hopefully soon that's going to be unveiled in a few times from now, right? So those are, I think, important building blocks if we want to go to what I call a tokenized ownership economy to the future. Maintaining that database that allows to compose transactions, compose even transactions between different markets, as I said, different smart contracts, while maintaining or giving the end user the right to self-custody, to own.
I think there's a sort of a few concepts that I'll draw out here, because there's also like a bigger vision piece that I think is important to draw out. I think so. Just from the point of view of functionality of the ledger, like first of all, atomic composability at scale is critical, because it's not just being able to scale simple actions, it's being able to describe entire economic transactions. And those economic transactions are almost always complicated. I think that where the bigger vision piece here is that when you start to think about economies and economic activity, most of the time, outside of the financial world, most of the time, there's only one leg of the transaction that is actually described within a transacting system. So if you think about card payments, the only thing you're really describing is the payment from the card issuer to the merchant. But the receipt of the underlying asset is done in an entirely different system. Mm-hmm. And that entirely different system is normally reconciled to off-ledger systems as well. And there isn't really any like sort of look through or like complete system that comes together. If you track this out, like, and you ignore all of the roadblocks that are necessary to get to sort of the final system, you can actually see a point where you have the ownership rights of objects that are both digital and physical, that are digitized, that are transferable according to sets of rules, and that the description of the entire economic transaction ends up being on ledger, like ends up being part of the system. So instead of just describing monetary flows or financial flows, you're describing entire economic activity or economic relationships. But that's only possible if you can not only have a model that represents this idea of atomic composability of transactions, but you also have this idea of native objects that represent ownership, either digital or physical, that is flexible enough to be able to describe everything that could be owned, but standardized enough so that within transactions it can be understood and composed. And I think that this is something that we've spoken about a lot, about all of the benefits that come out of that if you can describe economies in that way, and how you can sort of describe systems that operate against those economies in a way that is sort of useful and helpful and beneficial to the people who live within those economies. However, before we sort of go down those rabbit holes, I'd like to sort of pull it all the way back to Satoshi's vision for a currency system on top of Bitcoin. I think the quality of your research and the depth that you've gone into Satoshi's writings and his thinking on currency is really like sort of shown by the fact that some of your research actually resulted in, is it the Satoshi Foundation releasing more papers and communications?
Like, this case was John that approach. John was one of the early collaborators of this project. So he engaged with the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, and so yeah, like basically the Harmony project had a contribution to the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, but it was through John. But yeah, I mean, we were working together.
Yeah, and so I think what would be really interesting is to talk a little bit about what Satoshi's view on Bitcoin was, and how he viewed the Bitcoin project, and whether or not the Bitcoin project was finished or unfinished from the point of view of creating monetary objects.
So, Satoshi, as probably the audience knows, he spent PG or the group, we don't know, spent like a couple of years being public. And initially, he started writing on mailing lists. Like that's the way he promoted the project. Initially, how he marketed it, and then later on, he with the help of community members, they opened the Bitcoin Talk forum, and that's where he started engaging more often and lengthy. And so, in all those messages that Satoshi shared, we can say the majority, like the 80% of the messages go around infrastructure points, like the network, the Bitcoin network, how it works, how it's maintained. Basically technological points from the technology. And the rest, we could say he talked a lot. He talked about several topics. The level of insights on Satoshi is unprecedented, but there's a lot of monetary economics part. So if you gather that and analyze it deep and put, let's say, coherence on what Satoshi was writing and was telling to the world, you can see there's a logic and very order in all the messages about monetary economics, like the monetary design that we want. So being 10 days, I think it was, after the white paper release, he shared in one of the chats that he had a vision of what he called, in a generic way, dynamic smart money on top of Bitcoin, on top of the asset. And by dynamic mass money, he wanted it expressed on communities. Like basically, he called it peer-to-peer social currencies or community currencies. So he understood that Bitcoin was the first step for something bigger, and he explicitly said it so. So he later on started describing why the design of Bitcoin, which was the real purpose of Bitcoin. So he spent a lot of time talking about basically the dynamics that are needed for a currency to work or look like. He even said that he even acknowledged that he didn't know how to adapt the supply of monetary asset, in this case Bitcoin, to what he called the real world value things. And that, we could say, that's the purchasing power. Like that's what he was describing right there, was how to adapt this to the local purchasing power. So he didn't know, he acknowledged that he didn't know how to do that with software. And later on, he reiterated that was like an end goal. He also talked about how to reference it to existing currencies, what we could say a pet. He also wanted to achieve that. But let's not forget that when he designed it, we didn't have all the primitives that we have now. Like the primitives was itself Bitcoin. So it's obvious that that was a very complex logic, very complex task to achieve. But probably even without realizing, he put all the basics to do that. Like Bitcoin was the base money. Like what we could say a global reserve currency, potential global reserve currency into the future. And the tokenization of Bitcoin, like the UTXO model, like follows. That was the basis for tokenizing not just Bitcoin, but could tokenize any asset value. So with that, you could know the real world value things, how they transact, how they transfer ownership. So with those primitives, you could do an autonomous monetary system. So that's
I think the important thing that I found fascinating from understanding your and John's research on Bitcoin was Satoshi basically said, look, we've built digital gold here. We've built something that is a limited supply currency that we expect over time, if the adoption of the platform, adoption of the currency, adoption of the Bitcoin network goes well, that Bitcoin itself will become incredibly valuable, which has obviously shown to be true. The
It is
other,
very, very focused on bootstrapping his dev.
yes,
That would
but
be
the other component of this was that he was also talking about the importance of variable supply currencies. Within a few days or a couple of weeks of the Bitcoin white paper coming out, the importance of variable supply currencies and how variable supply currencies actually serve a very important purpose within economies. It was actually as a result of, it wasn't until that you and me spoke about this idea of economic growth and how money and economic growth have a direct relationship to each other, that the penny dropped for me so much on this. I knew that flexible supply currencies were important for the management of economies, but I didn't really understand why until we talked about this idea that, well, if you have a limited supply currency and you have economic growth, then there is only so much currency to go around. And at a certain point, you're going to get a liquidity crisis. You're going to get that currency, if it's Bitcoin, is going to have more and more people who want to be able to borrow it, to be able to use it if it's actually the currency of a nation, or the currency that a business can use to be able to fund their operations. You will then have the situation where the currency is going to have to be taken away from one opportunity and put into another. You create this zero-sum game where economic growth itself is a social benefit. It increases the ability for people to earn, it increases the productivity of companies, and it increases the income of nations. But if you have a situation where there is only a limited supply of currency and you have to reallocate that according to opportunities available, or it's locked up and you can't allocate any more to other opportunities that are available, then you end up in this situation where you're actually putting brakes on economic growth. And that this is the relationship ultimately between inflation targeting, monetary policy, and base rates, where the central banks are just constantly trying to make sure that they aren't overstimulating an economy, but aren't putting brakes on an economy where true economic benefit can be derived from the increase in productivity that emerges as a result of being able to lend and borrow, and being able to increase the circulating supply of currency. And equally, in the opposite direction, when you have economic retrenchment, being able to do it in the other way. Now, I'm not sure that that's necessarily what Satoshi was talking about when he was talking about this importance of elastic currencies, but he was recognizing this idea that really what everyday people want is they want their purchasing power to stay approximately constant against the main things that they want to be able to buy, and having something that didn't expand when economic activity expands would, by design, make it much harder to allow people to have purchasing power parity, consistent units of value. Now, while you think, well, from the point of view of the person who owns currency, that's fine. But from the point of view of people who are creating debts in that currency, which is ultimately what an entire economy runs on, that becomes very problematic. So I think it's a fascinating area that sort of points to this idea that not only do you need reliable stores of value that can be used as commodity money in the form of Bitcoin, you also need things that actually operate like money within an economy for you to actually be able to have a functioning economy in the first place.
Yeah, so you touched good points, and maybe responding in parts. So Satoshi what you say. Like he made it explicit. He even compared it, at one point compared one asset with a fixed supply and volatile value. And by volatile value, here he expressed volatile in purchasing power and in foreign exchange value, meaning in market price. And he compared it with an asset with an elastic supply and stable value. And he contrasted it. And if you collate that with the vision that he had, like he shared, he wanted dynamic smart money, those elastic currency that could adapt, and not just one global smart money. He talked about communities. He knew that the stabilization of purchasing power is a local relationship, it's a local phenomenon, because there are no two economies alike. There are no two economies that are the same. There are no two economies that have the inputs in the productive process, like the machinery, the capital goods, human capital, costumes, traditions, weather, resources. Like the resources could be the root. Economies are related to your heterogeneous. So if you don't adapt, this is like a scale. If you don't adapt the balance of supply to the state of that economy, you by design, you're gonna have imbalances. So Satoshi knew those things, and that's why he made explicit that he wanted that. But as he didn't know how to do it with software, he did what would be the foundation to achieve that. And basically, he described what that foundation as a base money. And we see it now as a store of value. But let's not forget that it's a store of value as long as there's demand. You said like Bitcoin is designed to be a store of value. It's store of value as long as there's demand. And why there's demand of Bitcoin? Because it's the first. And it's the most secure. It has the network effect. But as what we see, other cryptocurrencies have copied the same. Like you mean like, okay, this by design is a store of value, or the rest should be a store of value. And that's not the case. It's the demand thing. It's a demand phenomenon. So in a monetary economy, it's extremely important to understand which are the incentives on the asset or the currency that is expressing the monetary function. It's extremely important because the incentives is going to drive the reaction function. That either I hold it, I spend it, I lend it, or whatever, or I exchange it. What I don't sell it, whatever. But whatever is the action that translates. If you understand that which are the inherent incentives of every currency system, that's an important, a crucial part. So if you have an asset, the inherent incentive is to hold it, because you know that whoever is going to spend, if this economy behind, if you hold it and you have the capacity to hold it because maybe you don't need it now. That's what in the industry they call the time preference of money. If you hold it today and don't spend it, maybe you can spend it in a year now. But what people usually miss there is that by the time you're not spending, if everybody follows the same incentive, there's no economy. Because an economy is around after a year and after year agreeing on a monetary object in between, on a medium of exchange. Yeah. So if you hold it, don't expect, there's a big assumption behind that. By the time that you're going to spend it in 1 year now, the price, the economy is gonna keep running. Yeah. So by the time you're gonna have purchasing power. If you hold it now and you can spend it for something for more tomorrow, it's because you have another currency system in parallel running.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. Like if the velocity of money within an economy falls to zero, then the economy collapses. And the effect of that is the destruction of value. Like the effect of that is the businesses go under, people stop getting paid salaries, things stop running. You have to continually have things running, and you have to continually have velocity of money for an economy to exist in the first place. And it's such a powerful, important idea. And it goes.
The economy in which there's no exchange of that medium, of that middle asset that we have in every transaction, that is money, it's called money. There's no income. Like, okay, I can tell you, here's that I offer massages. I offer an hour of massage. But if you don't pay me for that hour, if you don't demand it, I don't have income. So my income of money for my work is that the same as if I produce, I don't know, a phone. I mean, if I'm a company producing phones, if nobody's purchasing it with money, I don't have income. So I don't expect that I'm going to be able to pay wages, to keep it reinvesting, to keep basically producing the good. So that's an assumption. Like, if you don't exchange, money is a medium of exchange. That's the primary function. That's what is money, really. Money, the total value it's a consequence. Let's say it's a function, a really important function, but it's a consequence of a good either monetary representation, the best object that it can represent. That's why in the physical world converges on gold. And in a system, if we're talking a system, that total value is the one that holds the best way the purchasing power of the economy.
Right.
So
I think just to sort of like highlight this explicitly, it basically means that you have to you can't have an asset, a store of value asset, that continually increases in value as the main medium of exchange for an economy, because it disincentivizes the velocity of money within a system. So like
people say that Bitcoiners, they say that it's possible, but it's possible because there's more demand of this asset, of Bitcoin, respect to fiat. So there's appreciation,
right.
but you're relying on an alternative, at least one currency,
Yes,
that function medium of exchange.
right.
If you didn't have any parts, the system cannot work.
Yeah, and your basic principle is like both of those things should be thought of within a decentralized system rather than just one of them. You're saying the fiat money is critical because that's what Bitcoiners, even Bitcoin maxis, actually want to use to be able to spend in an economy. Like the current a everyday medium of exchange is what they want to be able to use because they want to hold their Bitcoin. Bitcoin's the thing that's going to go up in value. I don't want to spend that. And so Bitcoin's very important, but it doesn't actually describe the other half of it, which is where the majority of economic activity actually sits. So let's move on to think a little bit about the three powers of any currency system. Maybe you can talk about that at a high level.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we go back to history, in reality, the history of money can be expressed in let's say three pillars. Like other people always talk about first the gift economies. There was not even money expressed. Then we had commodity money and or even credit. Credit and commodity, they were born kind of at the same time, and that's always the debate in different schools of thought. But the reality is that they were running quite in parallel. So commodity money, and then later on in time we had representative money, meaning we could issue paper on top of a commodity, and the convergence of those commodities went into metals, precious metals, mainly silver and gold, right? So that's where, with the representative money, that's where the power, decentralization of power mainly converges, right? And that's where kind of the different powers of money starts to merge. But there are powers of money that emerge out of a social context, but with a reason of why, right? Like, so the first power of any monetary system is the power to regulate it. Is the power to let's say decide calibrate what's the amount. If we agreed on that this necessity of it to being adaptive, to be elastic respect to a local economy, the next question is how do you regulate that elasticity? So that's the first power. It's the monetary policy. That's the monetary process of power. So nowadays that power is on the shoulders of the famous central banks. So the second power is, okay, if you regulate it, how do you distribute that elasticity? is the second power. So that power nowadays is shared between the governments, like the treasuries, the fiscal authority of the government, and the banking system. The banking system is the private partner that distributes currency and distributes that elasticity. And they get in the process what's called the savings. Is the income out of distributing currency, right? So that's the second power. And the third power is the power to redistribute currency, because you may think that redistributing is not important. I mean, why do we pay taxes? But I think taxes is not just to feed the first two powers. That part of it is to balance the first two powers, the monetary and the distributed, but also to provide public goods. And there's an entire literature about this topic, like the commons, around the commons. There's in fact a Nobel Prize, Eleanor Astrom, that talks about these topics. So in the economy, we have public goods. Who's gonna pay the roads between two towns? My town or your town? Or is it gonna be a private agent? Are we gonna pay tolls every time that we move between towns? Or, or the payment of a street? Like, who's gonna pay? I mean, there are several things that who's gonna pay. Everything was private and monetizable by a private entity. We couldn't be good at coordinating. So let's be honest, like, there are public goods that need to be spent. So that's where the fiscal power comes in. So if you disclose those three powers, the monetary policy, the distributed power, and the redistributed power, would say the fiscal power, and you see who is them there. I mean, where's the umbrella at the moment in this current system? You can see that all of them are under the umbrella of the government state, because the central arm is a subsidiary, it's like an entity, it's a delegate of the government. They call it independent, but we know there are governments that they don't have independence, but in reality, it's part of the government. It's a branch of the government, right? So under the distributive power, the government is there too, with the deficit spending. Like, there's a good paper from UCL University about the consolidated fund of the United Kingdom, and that's very well expressed of how the deficit spending runs in the economy. So
I think what's really interesting about these three powers, the monetary policy, the distribution policy, and the redistribution fiscal policy, like, through those three things, almost every major geopolitical, national, and historic event, maybe that's too much, but like almost every major geopolitical, national, and historic event can actually be looked through the lens of those three things. The history of the world, in many ways, is the history of the things that happened within the nations that were affected by monetary policy, distribution policy, and fiscal policy, and ultimately who was in control of those three things and how those three things were governed. Like, if you look at monetary policy, the ability to control the supply of money, Rothschild once said, one of the Rothschilds once said, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws." If you look at the sort of the times where economies have failed, they've generally failed partly as a result of mistakes in monetary policy, either because monetary policy was controlled by a set of people who were either incompetent, inept, or were corrupt. And you see those results in things like hyperinflation. You saw that, during the Weimar Republic in Germany, during sort of the Zimbabwe more recently under Robert Mugabe. And so the monetary policy itself, like all of the structures that we have in place today in modern economies, a big part of that, outside of the basics of the separation of the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive, there's also this concept of the separation between the government and central banks for exactly this reason. And the many of the battles within that and mistakes come down to the politicization of monetary policy, which is what, like the history of America today, in sort of like the Jerome Powell era, like all of that, the problem of like overprinting of money that led to this sort of huge period of economic growth for America from the sort of 1950s, to the 2000s and onwards, and like right up to the collapse of the property market in 2008. Like all of that can be traced back to decisions in monetary policy. And then you go to this concept of distributive policy, like the power of banks, that single ability to be able to borrow more cheaply than anyone else can, because you can borrow directly from the central bank or the Federal Reserve, and then be able to lend that out in the economy, is essentially a pseudo monopoly right, or at least an oligopoly right, that gives you a license to make money for free, because you have the ability to distribute money into the economy. And until now, that existence of that banking infrastructure that intermediates between central banks and retail and everyday people meant that you had, and you introduced me to this, the cantonal effect, that the closer you are to the creation of money, the more benefit you can get from it. And so, like, all of the history of financial regulation, and in many cases when banking was less regulated, when you think about sort of wars which were essentially caused by the actions of banks, if you think, talk about the Venetian periods, or sort of like early European periods, where the decisions that banks made on distribution of money and whom they distributed it to, whether sovereigns or individuals, actually defined conflicts that came out of that. And then at the redistribution fiscal policy level, you've got this idea of like how a government's responsible for the infrastructure of a country, both from the point of view of educational and from the point of view of physical infrastructure, and like how decisions around that actually have a long-term effect on the health of an economy and an economy's ability to grow. And like those two things like work hand in hand with each other, and you see where that falls down, how that creates a constant drag on an economy because it adds expenditure and costs and problems that wouldn't be there otherwise. And where countries do that very well, how that creates boosts and benefits to their economies that last for generations. And so I think that these three powers of currency systems are some of the least understood areas of the world, and how the world works and how economies work, and ultimately the things that mediate so much of our lives. That I think it's important to fully like appreciate what these three powers mean, and that they are true powers. They aren't just like a power from the point of view. Yeah, they are true power.
Yeah, there's things right, the running of the world, and as you said, like there's a very large past dependency on the history of money. It's not, I mean, different technologies, different type of institutions of money have been running out of the history of civilizations, but there's been a huge, if you see the history, there's a large past dependency on what happened at some point and why we have this institution like it is now. It goes back maybe to 100 years ago. For example, the current system we have, fiat, it's a large part of the dependency emerging from the First World War. For the consequences of the First World War, basically, we had the standard, a set of rules globally that were destroyed by entering a war. The aftermath of that war basically created all the patches that the world tried to put to recoordinate back again.
Right.
But you cannot reporting it after all the suffering and all the destruction in the same way that you had before. So they try to go back to standards, and the voltage stuff, the period between wars, they try to go back to our gold standard. They didn't achieve it. That was the voltage standard. Later on, we had the Bretton Woods conference, where that's a top design of it's like, let's top down, try to coordinate that global system for money. And so the design of that, we have it now, we suffer it now. Like, by the hegemon, like the reserve currency, breaking the rules of that agreement, of that Bretton Woods agreement, we have the advanced dependency of now, because Bretton Woods was a global system. So if you break the agreement of that global system, you now have a global fiat system, and it is the first time in history that we have this experiment. So just a comment, it's the first time in history we have this experiment, but not the first time we have fiat. Like a global coordinated fiat. So all the fiat systems, always, in every period in time, have gone back to a representative money, meaning to money, to currency that is backed by a type of commodity. So I don't think this time is different. But it's because convergences of sustainability, like what's the sustainable path for the history of humankind, in a way that we are going to coordinate and govern our societies. So
I think it's also a factor. I think it's also a factor of necessity, though, as well, right? Like if your fiat system collapses, the only thing that you're left with is going back to something that is backed by a hard commodity asset. And until the creation of Bitcoin, that was always
it need to be an outside asset, meaning an asset that nobody issues. Nobody, it's something that either you find in nature, or something that nobody can control its issuance. So back in the day, in the physical world, that was like the best representation of that. That's why the history of money converged on that tangible asset. So we now have an alternative.
Yeah. And I think that this thinking about money also leads to these like idea of the first power, monetary policy, how that affects your sort of like two different types of currencies, right? Dependent currencies and independent currencies. Maybe you can talk a little bit about those two ideas.
Yeah, so going back to the first power of monetary policy, right? If monetary policy is what regulates that elasticity of money, for that you need a reference, and regulating respect to what I'm gonna be able to regulate it to, respect to what. Like value is always a relational concept, right? So either I'm regulating it respect to my local economy, to my local purchasing power, the aggregate amount of goods and services that this currency can buy. That's called an independent currency. If I can regulate that monetary policy respect to my local economy, that's independent. The alternative is if you regulate it based on another currency, like tagging it to something that already exists. So you are dependent. Like there's another economy that they have their own calibration process, like their own monetary policy process with their own targets, their own tools for monetary policy, and you're tagging to them. Like I'm saying, like, okay, I think you're doing good. I'm copying you, or either because you are the world reserve currency or you are very strong currency. I mean, you're not gonna tag to something that is being debased every day. But that's a dependent approach. So and then in that spectrum of dependence, there's a a few type of what's called exchange rate arrangements. So dependence you have from the hardest tech to something more soft, more that you can put parameters in the middle. Like you can put even to soften it to based on some of your internal indicator of your economy, but you're still pair, right? Or combining a basket of currencies instead of one gives more softness to that pair. But still, we can mirror like to process. It's like either you are independent, like basically you can autonomous, like you can automate or not automate, sorry, like regulate the monetary policy based on your local economy, or you can't, and you pay it to something. And that's basically the two scenarios. So in the industry, we currently either have I wouldn't say a currency because it's not adaptable. Like cryptocurrencies are rigid supply asset, and some of them are, let's say, has some type of elasticity, like deflationary currencies, like Ethereum, for example. They burn based on activity. They based on the fees that the network generates, but it's kind of a negative feedback loop instead of it's not a balancing feedback loop, let's say. So what is not a balancing feedback loop can be designed to be a currency. So we at the moment don't either have our very rigid mechanics of assets, very rigid supply for some assets like Bitcoin or some of them, or some of these that really the indicator, let's say, is not calibrated to the state of the economy, or the majority of the stability we imported from the systems that already exist. In this case, the 99% comes from the dollar by pegging the monetary policy stable points to the dollar.
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna dwell on that for a second because I think the implications of that are really non-obvious. So I'm just going to take the idea, starting with the idea, like something that I've said for a very long time. I think you have adopted this very enthusiastically, which is money as a local phenomenon. And the reason this is important to think about is that we already think about nations. Let's just think at the scale of a nation rather than a smaller unit. Why does it matter that a nation has monetary independence on its policy? The reason it matters is because my country might be going through entirely different economic circumstances than your country. Your country could be doing great. My country could be doing badly. What I want in the event that my country is doing badly is I want to be able to reduce the supply of money or stimulate the economy. I want to be able to do those things, but I need to be able to choose them depending on what is necessary. And it depends on what is actually happening within my economy that indicates what the right monetary policy I need to be doing for my economy. If I peg my currency to another country's economy, I am importing their monetary policy. I have no ability to change the monetary base of my country. And so what I do is then, if I'm importing the dollar and America makes bad monetary policy decisions, those bad monetary policy decisions also affect my country. And I no longer have any levers to be able to pull to be able to react to what's happening in my economy. And you see this, that I think there's been several historical events that this happened for, but I think the most recent one that people will be aware of is the Greek crisis that occurred as a result of taking on the euro. You have Germany, which is doing incredibly well as an economy, for very large part because what's actually happening is that the euro, it stays weaker than it would do otherwise because the other Eurozone countries are not doing as well as Germany. And as a result of that weaker euro, Germany continues to do well as an export-led economy. And so all of this value is being pulled in whilst the currency is still staying relatively low because these other economies inside Germany are not doing so well. And what's happening is all of the value is being pulled out of these economies. So all of the resources, all of the talent, all of the property, everything is ending up being bought up from these economies that aren't doing well. So you're seeing, places like Greece having having huge amounts of the resources that they actually need for their own economy being pulled out as a result of the strong economic power that's happening in Germany versus the weak economic effect that's happening within Greece. And so this ability to be able to, and like this is part of the reason that the UK stayed on the pound, right? And didn't adopt the euro, is this ability, this first power of controlling monetary policy was so important, is so important to the regulation of economy. And what we don't think about in crypto is this at all, because all we want is some approximation of a stable value. So like just pegging it to the dollar's fine. That's fine. But that's only when
we don't foresee the consequences that will bring. That's not a sustainable model for the world. Like,
well,
if everybody,
it's because you aren't running economies on top of public ledgers. All you're doing is you're running businesses, like individual businesses that have some that most of the people who are interacting with it, their cost basis is outside of the crypto platform. Their cost basis is in fiat, in their country's currency. And so I think that, like, you often talk about this being a Bretton Woods moment for the digital age, and I think that you're absolutely right. And it's starting. And the way that we create systems now, and the way that we think about these systems now, is going to have a real effect on whether or not it is possible to run money for the benefit of as a public good, or money is run for the benefit of specific specific organizations, or specific entities that have a privileged position within an economy. And like ultimately, like, this is why I find why I think it's important that that we do this research. This is why, you know, I wanted you to come on to RDX and give you the scope to be able to write this research and then come out with this research and put these ideas out into the world, because I think without that education, and without that sort of like that thinking of what we want the world to look like in the future, and where those powers should sit, when you're thinking about, if you're thinking about creating a global public good from the point of view of infrastructure, like, is it also possible to think about a global public good from the point of view of money itself? And how can you make it so that you don't create these problems that can emerge as a result of the control of monetary policy, the control of distributive policy, or the control of fiscal policy that has affected so much of our human history to date? Now, there's a very, very, very large BHAG, you know, big, hairy, audacious goal. And right now, this is very much just a research project. It's just, here's the things that we have found that we think are interesting for people to understand and know. And here's how we're thinking about what kind of systems may look like or may emerge that could protect the public good of money, and why it's important to care about that, and why it's important to do that. And so, you know, from my perspective, you know, this project, in terms of actually building something, could go nowhere, or it could go somewhere. But ultimately, the first and most important thing is about getting people to understand these ideas and being part of and being an active part of the conversation about what people might want the future to look like as these new tools emerge, as we go through this Bretton Woods of a digital age, and are able to have conversations about what we want the future to be, rather than the future just being an emergent property of status quo, right?
Yeah, I think what excites me of this project is that, first of all, I think we as humans, we have the right first to gather and explore and discuss and debate critically, deep, about these topics in a way that anybody can learn. Because as you rightly pointed out, these are very influential topics. Like, it's not something, it affects our lives. It's probably the institution that affects the most of our life. So having a forum where we can join and share is a community of people interested in this topic. First of all, that's important. And second, I think that we are in a stage in history that, thanks to Satoshi, of course, and all the advancements later, we now have the tooling to think deep about a redesign of some of the primitives that currently exist and are somehow, some of them may be abusing of powers, and think deep about how these tools can make that better for the world. So, and that just cannot happen on just any random technology. Like, as we initially started, the technology for that needs to be, first of all, one that allows huge amounts of tokenization, and second of all, parallel swapping, like parallel transactions that imply cross transfer of ownership rights, and in real time. So
I mean,
that's
you've jumped straight to something there that I think will emerge. Like, people, like, I know you care deeply about that. I think that it'll take a little bit of time for people to understand why what you've just said actually does matter. But I think that I think that all of these things, the most important thing is the ideas first, and then the sort of the implementation second. And so
people need to understand the first principles of what's the problem, or why this is important, and why historic money, what happened, which are the path dependencies that we are in. Then later on, build the first principles on for policy systems. Okay, what really is, like, let's forget about the tooling that we currently have. Like, let's think about alternatives. Which are these alternatives? What will be the tooling in each alternative? Which are the possible solutions? And explore from there. So once you have that groundwork, you can build. Like, you can understand way more complex things, like way more complex systems. And that's where the proposed standard of this carbon money project will be understood, like, in a deeper way. And as a conclusion, I would say that now it's possible. Like, with these technologies now, that's possible. Like that, having these three powers running, I'm not going to say all of them autonomously, but maybe the first one, the monetary policy running autonomously, that's important. That's very important. And the second and third power needs to be democratized. The distribution and the fiscal powers. Those are things that we as community need to coordinate, observe the governance of that. So this technology, what allows us is to coordinate those three powers in new ways, in a new paradigm, let's say. So yeah, let's explore it together. Let's bring the world. Let's have fun. Learn together, and let's see where it goes.
Thank you very much, Lluis. And I'm sure everyone will be hearing from you much more over the coming sort of weeks and months. But I hope everyone enjoyed listening to this and is keen to read more of the research as it comes out. Thank you very much, and speak soon.
Thank you, Chris. Have a good day.
More utility, then you better call on these guys. I'm going radical, I'm going Radix, I'm going radical, I'm going Radix. Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline, building the future, I feel like a savage.